All right, fellow sociology droids, get ready, because we're diving headfirst into Megan Ravenhill's The Culture of Homelessness.
We're looking at the 2008 edition, really picking apart those arguments. You know, the methodology, all that good stuff that you need to know for your seminars.
Exactly. Think of this as like your grad-level cheat sheet for tackling this book. And one of the first things Ravenhill does is take on the very definition of home. It's not just about bricks and mortar.
No, it's about that feeling, safety, belonging, really feeling like you have a place in the world. And that's what a lot of those official definitions miss.
It's about lacking that home feeling, even more than lacking an actual address.
Right, and you see that in how policies often focus on the symptoms of homelessness, not the causes.
Like she talks about how a lot of definitions focus on precarious housing situations, which sometimes leaves out like single men sleeping rough.
Exactly. So to illustrate this, Ravenhill uses these route maps. Think of it as a timeline of a person's life, but it's layered with the social and personal factors that kind of lead them towards homelessness.
I found those so powerful. You really see how like childhood trauma, leaving home young, even things that seem small at the time all build up.
It's not just one thing, it's a process. And you see that in her data, people who left home before 19 were so much more likely to end up chronically homeless.
It's like this chipping away at your resilience, right?
Yeah.
And Ravenhill doesn't just hit you with stats. She takes you inside the homeless subculture through her research.
It's real in-depth stuff. She introduces you to different types of people. The clowns who use humor to cope, the quiet ones who retreat inward, the loners.
It's almost like an anthropological study, it's so vivid.
And she doesn't shy away from the difficult stuff either. She has this quote from Jason, a homeless man, who says, "What do you see? An alcoholic or a drunk? It's important, you think it's all the same, that we're drunks and alcoholics. Well, remember this. We are alcoholics because we drink too much. But a drunk is someone who beats up on his wife. None of us are drunks. None of us are like that. We have nothing to do with drunks."
Really powerful stuff. And it kind of challenges that perception that substance abuse is the problem, when really...
It's a symptom, isn't it? A way of coping with the trauma and the chaos of their situation.
And that leads her to critique the homeless industry itself, how even funding models, public perception, even good intentions can create a system that makes things worse.
It's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. The industry needs homeless people to justify its own existence.
And the people rely on that system for survival.
It's this codependent relationship that Ravenhill calls out.
And she looks at it through this historical lens, like she traces the evolution of British homelessness policy, and she talks about the 2-year rule from the 1996 Housing Act.
Which was supposed to encourage self-sufficiency, but...
It ended up pushing people into these like substandard temporary accommodations, B&Bs, with barely any support.
It's kind of paradoxical, right? Trying to help, but actually making things worse.
Yeah, and she ties this back to her argument about home. Those temporary accommodations lack the very things that build that sense of belonging and security.
And she even points out how important a reliable address is. It's about your sense of self, your place in society.
Without it, how do you break free?
Exactly. And that's where her analysis of social capital comes in. Homeless individuals often lack those connections, the resources to navigate society.
It's like they're stuck in this web of disadvantage. And one of the parts of the book that really got to me was when she talked about people trying to leave the streets.
Leaving is only half the battle, isn't it?
Right. She quotes Chris, who was homeless for years. And he says, "Even when I moved in, I felt that I was still homeless. The future is down to me now. It is hard to get back into mainstream society because when you've been homeless, you lose a lot of self-esteem. After that, it is hard to get back into feeling normal."
That feeling of displacement, it lingers, even when you have a roof over your head.
And she found that the support systems don't always address that.
Programs focused on normalizing people often miss the mark. They need help dealing with the trauma, the loss of that community, the bureaucracy.
It's almost like they're stuck between a rock and a hard place. They need to reintegrate, but the system makes it harder.
Exactly. Like hostels with strict rules might prevent residents from working or building connections outside. They end up isolated.
So it's clear from Ravenhill's research that there's no straight line to homelessness, and the way back is just as complex. She doesn't offer any simple solutions.
No, but she argues for this more nuanced approach, one that recognizes the individual and the systems at play.
It's about understanding those route maps, those journeys, and tailoring help to those specific needs.
Because home is more than just bricks and mortar. It's about fostering belonging, security, and agency. And without that, Just giving someone a house isn't enough.
What I really appreciate about Ravenhill is how she uses research to challenge how we think about homelessness. She's not just presenting data, she's pushing for a real change in perspective.
She's urging us as sociologists to go deeper, to look at all the social forces, the individual stories, and the flaws in the system that keep this problem going.
Yeah, it's about moving beyond just managing the problem and thinking more about prevention, getting to those root causes, and creating a society where everyone can actually thrive, you know?
It's like she really hits home that homelessness isn't this isolated thing. It's connected to everything,
Right.
like poverty, the lack of affordable housing, mental health services that are stretched too thin.
And she doesn't hold back on calling out policies that actually make the problem worse, like the reduction in welfare benefits.
Yeah, it's supposed to make people work, but
A lot of times it just ends up pushing people deeper into poverty, making them even more likely to end up homeless.
right, because it ignores all those structural barriers people face.
Right.
It puts all the responsibility on the individual instead of looking at the system. She talks about the psychological impact, too, that feeling of powerlessness that comes with homelessness. She quotes a man who says, "You feel like you're nobody. You're just a number, just another homeless person on the streets."
That's heartbreaking, you know? That loss of self-worth when you're constantly being pushed aside and treated like you're less than human.
And she argues that this psychological side is often forgotten when we talk about policy and interventions.
Yeah, it's like we're so focused on the practical stuff, we forget about the emotional toll.
Absolutely. One of the things she looks at is the role of public spaces in the lives of homeless people.
Because it's not just about shelter, is it?
No, these spaces become like social hubs, places to connect, find resources, a sense of community when the rest of the world has shut you out.
Like parks, train stations, anywhere that offers a bit of breathing room.
But even those spaces can be hostile. She found instances of harassment from authorities, even just regular people. Imagine constantly being told to move on, never being allowed to rest.
Always being watched, judged.
It just reinforces that sense of being different, unwelcome.
Like you don't belong.
Exactly. And Ravenhill says that this just adds to the trauma of homelessness and makes it even harder to reintegrate.
It makes sense, right?
Yeah.
If you're constantly being treated like a problem, it's hard to see yourself as anything else.
She's really critical of policies that criminalize homelessness. You know, things like getting fined for sleeping in public or bans on begging. It's not solving anything, it's just hiding it away.
Like sweeping it under the rug instead of dealing with the real issues.
And she argues that this just deepens that cycle of poverty and marginalization. Her research also goes into the link between homelessness and mental health. She found that a lot of her interviewees had mental health issues, things like depression, anxiety, PTSD.
And it's not a one-way street, is it?
No, it's a two-way thing. Mental health challenges can make someone more vulnerable to homelessness, but the trauma of being homeless can also trigger those issues or make them worse.
So it's like this awful cycle.
Exactly. Mental health leads to instability, which leads to homelessness, which makes your mental health worse. And Ravenhill argues that any intervention has to address both sides of that.
Yeah, you can't just treat one without the other.
One of her main arguments is that we need to move away from thinking of rough sleeping as the only way to define homelessness.
Because there's so much hidden homelessness, isn't there?
Absolutely. People living in cramped conditions, temporary accommodations, people who are constantly on the edge of eviction.
And if we only look at the official statistics, we're missing a huge part of the picture.
We're underestimating the problem. It's about seeing that precarity, that instability that can lead to homelessness, not just the most visible part of it.
And this ties back to her critique of the homeless industry. A lot of services are geared towards crisis management, dealing with rough sleeping, but not those underlying causes.
It's a Band-Aid solution, not a long-term fix.
Right, and she points out that the funding models often encourage that. Organizations get more money for dealing with immediate crises than for preventing them,
So there's this weird incentive to just keep managing the problem.
instead of actually solving it.
And she says this ignores all those individual stories, the unique circumstances that led each person to this point. Now, when she talks about reintegration, she doesn't offer any easy answers.
No, because it's so complicated.
She acknowledges all the obstacles, both inside and outside, that people face trying to rebuild their lives.
It's almost like a culture shock, isn't it? You've adapted to surviving on the streets, and then suddenly you're expected to just fit back into a world that can be pretty harsh.
She quotes a man who was homeless for a long time, and he talks about how even after finding housing, he still felt homeless. It's that feeling of displacement that sticks with you.
Yeah, like you're still on the outside looking in.
And she points out that you're often losing that community, the support network you built on the streets. It's like losing a family at the moment you need it most.
And then there are all these expectations, right? Get a job, manage your money. Like, it's all so simple.
But you're dealing with trauma, the stigma of being homeless, and the system can be so hard to navigate. It's like setting people up to fail.
So what does Ravenhill suggest?
She argues for more holistic support services, things like trauma-informed care, job training that takes into account people's specific skills and barriers, long-term mental health support.
So it's about recognizing that reintegration is a process. It takes time.
And just giving someone a place to live isn't enough. It's about creating that feeling of belonging, giving them a sense of agency, hope for the future. And one thing I really appreciate about Ravenhill's work is how she emphasizes the strength and resilience of homeless people. She doesn't see them as just victims.
Right, they're survivors.
Exactly. She sees their ability to adapt, to be creative in the face of incredible hardship. They create their own communities, support networks, even economies on the fringes of society.
It's pretty amazing when you think about it.
And she criticizes how the homeless industry often ignores this agency, focusing on control and regulation instead of empowerment.
Like they're trying to fit people into a box instead of helping them find their own way.
Exactly. She says we should be learning from their strengths, their resourcefulness, their lived experiences to come up with solutions that actually work. And she talks about how important it is to include people who've experienced homelessness in policy discussions, in designing programs, and the very systems that are supposed to help them.
Because they're the experts, right?
Absolutely. It's about shifting the power dynamics, recognizing the knowledge that comes from having navigated that system firsthand. And she doesn't shy away from the difficult topics either. She talks about the violence and victimization that happens within the homeless community.
It's a reality we can't ignore.
She talks about assaults, robberies, exploitation. And it's not just from outsiders. It can happen within the community itself. It's a reflection of the desperation, the lack of resources, the constant struggle to survive.
It's a side of homelessness that we don't often see.
And she points out that this violence often goes unreported, uninvestigated. It leaves people feeling even more vulnerable and marginalized.
Like they're invisible, forgotten.
Exactly. It's a reminder of how the system fails to protect them, how this cycle of violence is allowed to continue. Now, when it comes to her methods, one of the most interesting things Ravenhill does is use these route maps. They're visual representations of the paths that lead to homelessness, showing all the different factors that come together to create each person's story.
It's like a visual timeline, right? You can see how different events and circumstances like childhood trauma, family breakdown, mental health issues, job loss, financial problems, all these things can intersect.
And it shows that homelessness is rarely caused by one single thing. It's usually this buildup of vulnerability, a series of setbacks that wear a person down.
It's like that chipping away at resilience we talked about earlier.
Exactly. And these maps can help us understand the specific needs of each person so we can offer help that's actually tailored to their situation. It's about recognizing that there's no one-size-fits-all solution.
Everyone's story is different.
And besides the route maps, she also does in-depth interviews. She spends hours listening to people's stories, letting them share their experiences in their own words.
That personal touch is so important.
It adds a depth and nuance that you just can't get from statistics alone. It captures the human cost of homelessness in a way that numbers can't.
It makes it real. You
Yeah.
know, you hear the voices of the people behind the data.
And she's really good at weaving those personal stories together with sociological theory. She paints this really vivid picture of what homelessness is actually like.
And one of the things that makes her work so strong is her commitment to reflexivity. She's aware of her own position as a researcher and the potential for bias.
She's honest about her own limitations, which actually makes her research more trustworthy,
It shows that she's careful, that she's trained to be as objective as possible.
And she does things to mitigate those biases, like long-term field work, building real relationships with her interviewees, constantly questioning her own assumptions.
It's about being aware of the power dynamics in research, the impact you can have as a researcher.
Absolutely. And she doesn't just focus on individual stories. She also analyzes policy documents, tracing how homelessness policy has evolved in Britain over time. She looks at how policies have changed, how they've been influenced by political ideologies and social attitudes, and how they've impacted people's lives.
It's like putting the current situation into context.
It helps us understand how we got here and how we might need to change our approach in the future. And what sets Ravenhill apart from other researchers is her willingness to really engage with the homeless subculture. She doesn't just observe from a distance, she immerses herself in it. She spends time in shelters, goes to support group meetings, talks to people on the streets,
She gets right in there.
and this allows her to really understand the social dynamics, the norms, the values, the survival strategies that people develop.
It's like an insider's perspective.
Yeah. Exactly. She talks about how homeless people create communities, build support networks, find ways to cope with the challenges they face. And she acknowledges the negative aspects too, the violence, the substance abuse, the exploitation. But she doesn't shy away from those things. She explores the complex factors that contribute to them.
She paints a full picture, warts and all.
And that's what makes her work so valuable. It's honest, it's nuanced, and it's based on a deep understanding of the complexities of homelessness. And one of the things she really drives home is the importance of social capital.
Those connections, relationships, and resources that can help someone avoid homelessness or get out of it.
Exactly. She found that people who had strong social connections, supportive families, access to resources, they were more likely to overcome challenges and stay housed.
It's like having a safety net.
Right. And on the other hand, people who lacked those supports were much more vulnerable to homelessness and were more likely to be homeless long term if they did lose their housing.
So those social connections can make all the difference.
And she criticizes policies that weaken social capital, things that isolate individuals or break down communities.
So it's not just about providing housing, it's about creating a support system, a sense of belonging.
Absolutely. And this brings us back to her point about the meaning of home. It's not just a physical space, it's about feeling connected, safe, and supported.
Yeah, it's not like getting an apartment suddenly makes everything okay.
No, exactly. It's about understanding that a roof over someone's head doesn't magically erase the trauma, the stigma, those systemic barriers that are still there. She really wants us to see resettlement not as the end goal, but as a whole other stage, a complex process of rebuilding your life and figuring out what home means in this new context.
And it goes beyond just providing services, right?
Yeah.
Ravenhill says we need to change how we see and treat people experiencing homelessness.
She's challenging that whole us and them mentality, like how dehumanizing language, stereotypes, even policies that have good intentions but miss the mark, all contribute to that separation.
It's like we create this distance that makes it easier to ignore the problem or come up with solutions that don't actually work.
One of the most interesting things Ravenhill argues is that the very system that's supposed to be helping can actually become part of the problem.
That's a tough one to swallow.
She uses the term codependency to describe the relationship between the homeless population and what she calls the homeless industry.
So the industry needs homeless people to exist to justify its own work.
Right, and the people experiencing homelessness become reliant on that system for basic survival.
It's a vicious cycle.
She gives the example of funding models that focus on crisis management instead of prevention. Organizations get more money for reacting to emergencies than for stopping them from happening in the first place.
So it's always putting out fires instead of preventing them.
Exactly. And that creates this cycle where the system is basically rewarded for managing homelessness, not for solving it.
So what's the alternative?
Well, Ravenhill critiques that focus on normalizing individuals, trying to make them fit into mainstream society instead of addressing the reasons they became homeless in the first place.
Like trying to force them into a mold that might not work for them.
Right. And it ignores all the real barriers people face, the lack of affordable housing, low wages, the lack of support.
And even when people do get housing, they're often left to figure things out on their own in a world that can be pretty hostile.
Exactly. The trauma doesn't just disappear when you have a roof over your head. It's about recognizing that real reintegration needs more than just an address.
It's about healing, about support, about breaking down those systemic barriers that keep people trapped.
And that's where Ravenhill's call for a paradigm shift comes in. She's not just saying we need more resources or better services. She wants us to change how we think about homelessness at a fundamental level.
It's a pretty big ask.
It is. She wants a more humane, compassionate, just approach. One that sees the inherent dignity and worth of every person, whether they have a home or not.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the culture of homelessness, fellow Droids, remember Ravenhill's main point. Home isn't just four walls and a roof. It's a complex web of needs, social, emotional, psychological. And addressing homelessness means untangling that web, understanding each person's story, and challenging the systems that keep this problem going.